Welcome back, my friend, to Healing Together, a YouTube channel dedicated to the God stories that are going on around us all the time. Thank you so much for stopping by. Today's story is again a story of the burn coming from the burn unit, where I was there for 6 months during 1972. I actually turned 17 in the hospital. And so I have been sharing stories over this summer, the 50th anniversary, and I want to share this story that comes from just 50 years ago, the Sunday after Thanksgiving. So it's right in this season. If you remember, of the last 3 videos that I shared with Thanksgiving and how difficult that was. I also shared about the specialty of having friends and how much they helped me to improve my attitude and to improve my outlook. When 35 or 40 of them came to the burn unit and stayed for 4 hours and visited with me, and how much that encouraged me. I want to share with you in this video about the very next day following that day. That was November 25th, 1972. The day I want to share with you is the day of November 26th, 1972, the very next day. Because of the 25th, because of the day before when everybody was there, some first took place there. I went someplace else to meet somebody. I got in a wheelchair and I went someplace else. I was up in the wheelchair for 4.5 hours. That was about 400% more than I had ever stayed up before. About the longest time I'd stayed up was about 4 months earlier in the burn unit. A nurse had put me in a chair and refused to put me back in bed and kind of punished me for not trying harder to survive. As I have always stated, I was just along for the ride. I got my medicine, I got my morphine, I got my Demerol, and I just was along for the ride. The people that are the heroes of my story are the people who prayed for me endlessly, the people who loved me no matter how ugly I was. And I'm talking physically and personality-wise. The nurses that came in day after day and took care of us, and the doctors that struggled to find better ways to cure us of their problems and to protect us from the infections. Those are the heroes of my stories. Many of the heroes of my stories are my peers who did come that day before and spend time with me. Debbie and Tim and Ted and Milo, Doreen and Kathy and another Kathy and Mike, and the people that would come and just spend time, come out to the house and spend time. Those are the heroes of the story of me in the burn unit. Today I want to share with you what happened the next day following. So I got up in the morning, and I always knew around 10 o'clock I would go over to the burn unit. The first time I'd been in the Mott Hospital, they dropped me in the tub, trying to put me in a standard tub. I was about 6 foot 1 inches tall, and I weighed about 100 pounds, 105 pounds. And so I was very hard to control. I had no muscle tone. I could not get in and out of the wheelchair without help. I couldn't get in and out of the tub, of course. there was no way I could get up off the ground like you have to get out of a bathtub. And so they would take me every day and they would bring me from the Mott Hospital, I was in the Mott Hospital so they could get me out of the burn unit where number one, they needed the bed. There was only 11 beds there. And second of all, they could get me into a hospital room where I could see people that were not always constantly covered with the protective clothing that you had to have to fight the germs and the infection in the burn unit. And so I knew about 10 o'clock each morning they would come and they would get me and they would take me over and I would get into the whirlpool tub, which they did by crane, and I would also have my bandages changed and get fresh bandages. At the time, I had 4 open spots. I had one on each arm, and I had one spot on each leg that was open that just would not heal. And so because I had been up and around so much, and the doctors knew that I had to have my blood circulation, they were kind of amazed that all of a sudden, because these young people that came to see me actually helped me to go through with some of the therapy that they knew that I needed. So when I got ready and they took me over for my tubbing, it's quite an interesting time because I'd never had any trouble with my tubbing before. I would go over, they would pick me up, they would put me on this gurney, they would pick me up in the gurney and they would set me in the tub, and they would take off my bandages. I would get up and out after being in the tub room, and they would take me across the hallway. It was real quick. I mean, just 6 months before, it was taking an hour and a half to wrap the bandages around me, and now they could do it in 20 minutes because they were only wrapping those 4 places, and it was real easy to do. So I got over and I got into the burn unit and I got ready to get onto the gurney, and there was a new either doctor or nurse, it seems like it was a doctor, and she started to cut the bandages off. And I said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "I'm taking your bandages off." I said, "You can't take my bandages off." I said, "They've been on there for 24 hours. You have got to get me in the tub and take them off in the tub." She said, "Oh no, we take the bandages off out here." And I remember clearly saying to her, I said, "Excuse me?" I said, "I've been here 6 months. Tell me again, how long have you been here? You started here yesterday or last week? I am afraid that I've got way more experience than what you do. You will not take those bandages off my legs until you put me in and they get to soak off so that they don't rip everything open again." So the nurse, of course, got into a huff, and I was already in a huff, and we got me into the tub, and she said, "Okay, take your bandages off as soon as you can. I got to get you out of that tub." And so I started to take the bandages off, and I was feeling pretty bad about myself, and so I started taking the bandages off, and we had a doctor there that I can't seem to find, that by the name of Dr. Richards. She was a partner, from what I understood, with Dr. Fellers, and Dr. Fellers is the one that founded the burn unit at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And she came in and she said, "How you doing today, Tim?" And I said, "I'm doing pretty good if I could train these doctors." And she laughed a little bit and she said, "How's those bandages coming off?" I said, "They're coming off real good." I said, "I got them almost all off." And she said, "Good." She said, "Get them off. We'll get you wrapped up. Then I want you to call your dad and we're going to send you home." just like that. And I said, send me home. She said, yes, we're going to send you home. I said, like back to the hospital room, or you're going to send me home? She said, no, we're going to send you home. It's time for you to go home. She said, you can get better at home. We can finish this from where you live at home. You can go home. Now, you would think that I would be dancing in the hallways, wouldn't you? But in reality, I began to cry. And I was so depressed because I knew I didn't have all the bandages off. And you have to understand, trying to take the bandages off, even though they were soaking in the tub, my hands didn't work. I just barely had fingernails on my left hand. I'd lost all my fingernails on my left hand, and they were gone for months. My right hand, I had lost my fingernails. They were growing back and doing pretty decent, but none of them were down past the quicks of what you would think. And my hands just wouldn't work. I couldn't grab a hold of anything. I had no muscle tone at all. And so I'm trying to get the bandages off, and I'm trying to get the things taken off and get myself together. And she came back in and she said, what's wrong, Tim? And I said, you're never going to let me go home. I can't go home. I'm too sick. Am I ever going to get to go home? And she said, oh, Tim. She said, you're going to go home. She said, as soon as we get you bandaged up, which you know don't take very long anymore. She said, as soon as we get you bandaged up, we're going to have you call your dad, and your mom and dad are going to come over and sign some papers, and we're going to show them how to change your bandages, and we're going to send you home, and you can go home today. And I can't explain to you the shock that came with that. The insecurity, the fear. I had gotten so comfortable in the hospital that it was like I was going to someone's home to stay that I didn't know. I got out and I got my bandages changed, and the doctor said, come on, we're going to give you a telephone, and we want you to call your room at Mott, or we want you to call wherever you're at, and we want you to get your parents to come and pick you up. We need your mom and your dad because we need to show them how to change your bandages and what you have to do, and we'll get some prescriptions and some stuff and get ready to get home. Little bit of comedy in the next hour, a little bit of almost sadness as I called and talked to my dad. So I get on the phone and they dial the number to get me to my room, and Mom picks up the phone, and I said, Mom, I need to talk to Dad. She said, Tim? And I said, yeah, this is Tim. I need to talk to Dad. So I got on the phone, and Dad got on the phone, and I said, Dad, I need you to come get me. They're sending me home. And he said, no, we told you before, have the orderly bring you back. We will be here when you get here. And I said, Dad, they're sending me home. You have to come get me so the doctors can have you sign some papers. Dad was quiet for a minute, and then he said, you mean you're going home to Niles? And I said, yes, I'm going home to Niles, and they want you to come over and Mom to come over so they can show you how to change my bandages, and you can sign the release forms, and they can get you the supplies that you need so I can go home. And he said, Tim, you better be telling me the truth. And I said, I am telling you the truth, Dad. And so Dad came over, had to get all garbed up, got into the burn unit, and they started to fill out the paperwork. And I think as I remember when we went to get the car, or they went to get the car because it was snowing like crazy that day. I think Dad was almost in shock that I was going home. I know I was, and I'm sure Mom was. And all of a sudden, and it really was not fair, thinking back on it, it was not fair. Mom had been living there for 6 months. Dad had been up there every week for 26 weeks. Dad had been up there. So essentially, he was living in both places. And so they had to go back to the apartment, unload the stuff out of the apartment into the station wagon, go to my room, unload the stuff out of my room into the station wagon, get me all situated, go to the pharmacy and get creams and pills and bandages. They sent all of that stuff home. And so we walked out with a box of material. Andrew and Pam, as I remember, was with us and rode home with us. And all of that stuff within just a few hours. And we were packed up and we were headed for Niles. I'll never forget the ride home. Dad pulled up underneath the canopy at the hospital and wheelchaired me out. I had been walking around in the room. I was excited. So I'd been walking around. It was the first time I had gotten to look into a mirror. I remember going into the bathroom and looking in the mirror. And I realized how folded over I was. I looked old. One of these days I'll get my cousin Jeff on here, who was up at the burn unit once, him and his family. And he said he couldn't believe that it was me, that all they got to do was look into the room. And he said, you look like you were 50 years old or 100 years old. And I remember looking in the mirror and thinking exactly that. I remember I had a pair of purple jeans on, jeans that were dyed purple. And I had a long sleeve shirt on, and everything just sagged on me, because I was probably wearing 32s or 34s, and when I left the hospital, I was probably a 26. And so everything just kind of hung on me. But we got down, we got into the car, and we got out on the road, and I had been driving already. That's how I'd had my accident. And we got on the road headed home. And I'll never forget, one of the vivid memories was we came down off the side street onto the highway. I'm not positive what road we were on, but I think we were getting on maybe 94. But it was a 4-lane expressway. And as we came off the ramp, we started to go under the bridge, and there was about a 69 or a 70 Mustang fastback, it looked like it had been, wrapped around the center pole of the bridge. And I remember the tail lights, and I remember thinking the tail lights and the headlights were facing the same way. And it had, if I remember rightly, it had hit the passenger side, and it had wrapped it right around that round post that held the bridge up that was going over the road. No emergency equipment. Nobody had stopped yet. And I remember Mom looking away from it. And as I looked at it, I thought, I'm going home, and that guy's probably going to the hospital. It's just a weird memory that was there. Don't remember much about the ride home except for how bad the roads were. The roads were horrible. I probably slept some on the way home. I know I was uncomfortable in the seat. I was always cold. And as we got home, we got in and we pulled into our garage. Again, we had 6 or 7 inches of snow on the ground outside. We pulled into our garage, and I couldn't get out of the car. I couldn't move my legs around. I couldn't bend my legs enough to get them out. And when I did get them finally out when Dad helped me to turn and to get out. And he said, you're going to have to turn and just set your feet out here on the ground, and then we'll get you stood up. I couldn't stand up either. Now, I learned as an ambulance attendant some years later how to move people like that, but nobody in my family knew how to do that. They hadn't showed him. And so we finally, after a real struggle, and it was cold, bitterly cold for me, and we got me stood up, and I walked into the house. We had no wheelchair at home, which was a good thing in the end. And again, nothing was prepared. Mom had not had time to come home and clean. We had somebody coming in to do some of the cleaning and do some of the laundry for Andrew, Pam, and my dad. But we had all these challenges. What were they going to do? We needed to change my bandages. We needed to get me in and out of the bathtub, which we only had one bathtub, and it had sliding glass doors on it, so you couldn't quite get in and out of it. And so everything was a challenge. Everything was hard. I couldn't sleep in my bed. I couldn't stand to sleep where I could hear Andrew breathing. Funny, crazy thing, ironic, I guess you'd call it, but I couldn't stand to be able to hear noises. Even though I had been in the hospital, and there was always the hospital noises, I couldn't stand the noises of home. It wasn't long that they got me a bed and got it put out in the patio, which was enclosed patio that I could stay out there. I'd be by the television, which we had one of those monster 25-inch consoles, which was big back then. And I had, that's where I slept, and that's where I stayed. If I didn't want to work in the hospital, I definitely didn't want to work at home. And so Mom almost could not drag me out of my chair, out of my bed. I would sit up against the headboard and I would watch TV, and that's all I did. When Dad would get home, and I'll do another video someday on just the idea of what Dad had to do to get me to walk, and what ended up we had to do to get me actually to heal. I would love to go back and find out what Mom and Dad were thinking that day. How much of a blessing and how much of a challenge it was. How much of a blessing it was, and yet how much of a curse it was. You know, it's funny, it wasn't until I got ready to do this video that I thought back, 1972. My dad was born in 30 and my mom in 31. And so, you know, they were the ages of my children now. They were 42 and 43. No, they were 41 and 42 respectively. My dad was 42 and my mom was 41. What I would look at now and say, my goodness, they're just kids and they're going through this. I'm not sure what they were thinking. I know they were glad to be home. I know Mom was glad to be in her home. Our home actually had been built 11 years before that, or not even, 11 years before that. My dad had built that. They had laid it out together, and they built the home. And so she was glad to be back in her home, the first one that they'd ever built. Next time I'm going to share with you a little bit of the good and the bad of being out of the hospital and home. I want to go a little bit more into what it's like to be released from the hospital and sent home after being burned over 87% of my body, having about 65% of it covered with skin grafts, having 10% of it destroyed by having skin grafts taken, by having skin taken. I want to share with you what that's like in a snowy, cold Michigan winter. And so you can imagine the challenges of that. Thank you for stopping by. If you would, hit that subscribe and like and notifications bell. I would appreciate it. Thank you so much for being a part of Healing Together. We're small, but we're powerful. And if the Bible says that we overcome the evil one by the blood of the Lamb and by the power of our testimony, I want to be a part of that testimony. So God bless you. Thank you for stopping by, and you have a great day.